This conversation is part of an interview project through the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. We're speaking with Yale alumni in order to more deeply understand the hearts and minds of those who work at the intersection of spiritual leadership and environmental action. Today, we are grateful to be joined by Reverend Jim Antal. Jim Antal is a denominational leader, climate activist, author, and public theologian. He serves as special advisor on climate justice to the General Minister and President of the United Church of Christ. An environmental activist since the first Earth Day, he has preached on the climate crisis since 1988 in over 400 settings and has engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience on numerous occasions. Jim's book, Climate Church, Climate World, is being studied by hundreds of congregations.
All right. Thank you so much, Reverend Jim, for being here and sharing in this conversation. I'm really excited. I would love if we could start kind of just, if you could take us to sort of the beginning and share a little bit about some of how your interest in this intersection took shape, or what some initial sparks in this were for you.
When I was a teenager, religion was very important to me. And in fact, I came from a broken home, and in a way, it was my connection with the Methodist Youth Fellowship that was salvific in my life. And when I changed custody from my mother to my father at age 15, my dad took me on a tour of the national parks, and I completely fell in love. So the next summer, I went backpacking. So I was 16 years old. I had no idea what I was doing. And a buddy and I went off to find the John Muir Trail, which we did find. We also found some bears and some other things. And really, that's how it all began for me. I went to college. I come from a family of scientists, I should say, and I went to college to major in math and physics. And somehow I took a turn because of having read Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Cost of Discipleship. I took a turn toward ethics. And while in college, I was concerned with philosophical ethics, but also growing up, another foundational experience, which actually connects with my environmental stuff, and I'll make the connection in a moment, was that in fourth grade, the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, and I had a friend whose family had just built a shelter in their basement, and we were on the bus together going to our fourth grade school, and I said to him, this was literally right in the middle of October that year. I said to him, if I am able to get to your house before the bomb explodes, would you let me in your shelter? And he said, I'm sorry to tell you, but my dad told me just 2 nights ago, we have a gun in our shelter and we'll shoot anybody that tries to get in.
Wow.
So, at age 12, that was also very foundational for me. And I knew kind of the stakes were high. So when I went to Yale Divinity School, my real desire was to get into the PhD program. I never imagined becoming a minister, and I did get into the PhD program. And environmental ethics was not a field anywhere. Paul Santmeyer had written a book, and I think maybe there was one other book kind of on theology and the environment at that time. But my professors were happy to let me study whatever I wanted. And so what I began to look at in the 2 years that I spent in the PhD program was the question of, what does it mean that God gave humanity such freedom that we can destroy not only ourselves, but God's creation? And you can see then the connection between climate change and nuclear war. Because that was my sort of philosophic, ethical, existential question that was driving me at that time, and has really driven all of my work. It turns out I'm dyslexic and I couldn't pass the French and German requirements for Yale PhD program. But fortunately, at that time, I was a teaching assistant for Henry Nouwen. Um, and we were best friends. And the day that I learned that there was absolutely no chance that I could go forward with my PhD, Henry said, "Let's go out to pizza." So we went to, there are several famous pizza places in New Haven. We went to one of them. I think it was Sally's. And Henry said to me, I was complaining about this was the worst day of my life and everything. And Henry said to me, "No, this is the best day of your life."
Mm.
And I wanted to kill him. Honestly, I just wanted to strangle
Yeah.
him. But instead I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you're supposed to be a minister, not an academician."
Mm.
And it was the Zen koan. It was the 2x4 coming across my
Yeah.
head and breaking. And so, then I finished up my Master of Divinity and I began teaching. I had been teaching in the summers, but I began teaching at a place called Suffield Academy, and I began teaching environmental ethics. This was 1978. So again, it still wasn't yet a field. I think we had one textbook at that time in environmental ethics, but it wasn't a theological ethics. It was really just a sense of values and the environment at that time. Um, and then gradually I went more and more toward ministry. And I guess I'll wrap this up by just saying my first sermon on the climate crisis was in 1988, just before Bill McKibben's book came out. And there had been James Hansen had testified before the Senate at that time, and there were things prior to that as well. And my congregation at that time in Newton, Massachusetts, um, I had initiated a Holocaust Memorial Sunday observance because Newton is a primarily Jewish town. And for a couple of years, we obviously focused on the Jewish Holocaust in Nazi Germany. But then, with having talked with my congregation about it, I said, this year let's focus on what we're doing to the environment as a
Mhm.
different understanding of Holocaust. And it was a stretch. It was a stretch, but even then, so this is 1988, even then, people recognized, oh, for many it was a horizontal kind of recognition, but for some it was a more immediate kind of recognition. And that was my first sermon, and I think since then I've preached over 400 times
Wow.
on climate. Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
That's a lengthy answer to that question, but it kind of puts a lot
No.
together.
Yeah, yeah, right. Um, yeah, and it's really interesting to hear kind of already. I know that you've sort of um, straddled in a lot of ways, both like activism, sort of congregational work, preaching and teaching, chaplaincy, different kinds of contexts. So I'm curious, like, just to hear a little bit more, maybe. I know the activism piece has been particularly important in like weaving through, but kind of as you think about these different worlds that you've traversed with this kind of ecological ethic at the center, kind of what has it been like in those different contexts to move through?
So first, I really want to thank you for that question. And it has always been the case for me, even back when I was like in junior high school and I began reading Bonhoeffer for the first time in eighth grade. It has always been the case for me that this understanding of siloed academic disciplines and siloed ethical disciplines, it never made any sense to me. So when I was an undergraduate, I did everything I could to sort of explode the notion that you have to major kind of in one discipline. And similarly, the division of activism on the one side and academics on the other side. It just never made any sense to me. So as soon as I heard about William Stringfellow, for example, the lawyer who was himself a big activist and somebody who manifests the kind of thinking I just articulated. It's like oh my God, there's somebody else out there who gets it, like I do. So I don't remember the first time I protested. It was probably in '72. No, it was before that. I was part of the first Earth Day and then part of the Vietnam War protests when I was an undergrad. Um, but then at Yale, a group of us who were involved with opposing nuclear weapons went down to the Trident subbase down in Connecticut. And at one point we got arrested there. I don't think we were charged, but the police hauled us off because they didn't like the sign that we had. Um, and that activity was completely and in a daily way connected with the daily communion service that Henry Nouwen was offering in the basement of the chapel at Yale Divinity School. And there was a group of sometimes as few as 6 of us and sometimes as many as 12 of us, which is a little hard to imagine. Wait a minute, there weren't 500 people there to hear Henry Nouwen? But it's true. There were maybe 6 of us or maybe 12 of us there. And at least half of the group, and maybe in some days the entire group, were activists. And to the point of your question, saw the link between the study of theology and ethics and the need to put your life on the line.
Mm.
So in terms of my, actual career or jobs, in addition to teaching and being a chaplain, in 1984, I became head of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which is the oldest interfaith pacifist group in America, going back to World War One, and a big part of the history of the FOR is engagement in various activist ways. The 40th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Jim Wallace and I organized a protest at Yucca Flats, where tests were still being conducted in Nevada. And we got Henry to come as our spiritual director. And over 1,000 of us walked the 8 miles from where we gathered to the trespass line. And then about 150 of us crossed the trespass line and spent 3 days and nights in jail. Um, Back to the sort of the sort of meta of your question. Um, it always seemed to me that if you hold these beliefs, of course you're going to act on them. And if our society is engaged in a violation of such fundamental and in some ways suicidal, on a broad basis, suicidal things, that, of course, you're going to use the gift of life in order to bear witness against this, for lack of a better term, human tendency that we have, which, again, goes back to my academic investigation of what does it mean that this is what we do with our freedom? Hello?
Right. Right. Yeah, wow. I mean, I just want to pick up on one thing you just said, sort of, it seemed to you that be obvious if you hold these beliefs, of course you're going to act on them, which I, totally feel. And it also strikes me as that's actually, it's not a given, right? There are so many ways in which we live with this kind of cognitive dissonance of what we believe and who we are in the world or how we act. So I'm curious kind of like it strikes me as one of the crucial needs of the kind of cultural and spiritual work of the climate movement or ecological movement is to help us bridge that gap between who we think ourselves to be, who we want to be, and how we behave. So I'm just kind of curious for you to speak from your vantage point and all of your experiences on how do we bridge that?
So first of all, let me just put into this conversation my other mentor. Henry Nouwen was one of my two mentors. William Sloane Coffin, the chaplain at Yale when I was there, and later on, I was a member of Riverside Church when he was the pastor at Riverside Church. He and I were very very close friends, and he was a model for me of the question you're asking that if you are going to um, train for and become a religious leader, of course, you're going to be actively engaged in the cutting edge issues, which most people regard as political. You're going to be actively engaged in those cutting edge issues, and Bill was my model, so that's one response. I had something else that I wanted to say in response to your question, but come back to me with what more you'd like me to comment on.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm curious um in your preaching or in your kind of spiritual work, chaplaincy, kind of pastoral care sort of work, is that something that you've seen people struggling with, and how have you supported people in kind of coming together into themselves in that way?
So two things in relation to that. One is when later in my career, when I became head of the United Church of Christ for Massachusetts. So I was we don't use the term bishop, but I was the equivalent of a bishop for about 400 congregations throughout Massachusetts. Um, within within 2 years, I think it was really my first year of being there, I had the privilege being the leader of it was about 900 clergy were there in Massachusetts. I had the privilege of convening them.
Mm.
And well, yeah, okay, fine. What'd you do with it? And to the point of your question, one of the things I did with it, and this has a pastoral and a prophetic dimension to it, because again, I never saw those as separate silos. To me, they were always connected. When we would gather, so maybe, 70 or 80 clergy in the room, I would say, let's do a histogram. And many of them had no idea what a histogram was. It's where you put your body where your answer to a question is.
Mhm.
So I said, okay, on this end of the room, so this was excuse me, this was 2007. It was just before 350.org and the climate movement began. And I would say to them, okay, come be on this end of the room if, uh, let's say, 4 times a year, at least 4 times a year, you mention the climate crisis or climate change in your sermons. And here in the middle, if you do it at least once a year, stand here. And over on this end, if you never preach, you yet to preach on the climate crisis, everybody,
Mm.
100% go
Wow.
there.
Wow.
And I wait for it, wait for it. They're all standing there looking at each other a little guiltily. And then I said to them, to the point of your question about kind of pastoral concerns, I said to them, listen, my friends, unless we begin preaching on climate, or at least mentioning it in our sermons at least once a month within 15 years. So do the math. This was more than 15 years ago.
Right.
Within 15 years, 100% of our sermons will be on grief.
Mm.
And that's because that will be the only relevant comment religious leaders will be able to make to the circumstances we have allowed to take place.
Wow.
And it wasn't like, people like said, "Oh, come on." No, nobody had that attitude. However, to the point of your question, it's not like as a result of hearing that, everybody began preaching on the climate crisis at least once a month.
Right.
And perhaps in a subsequent question, we could talk about grief. But as you and anybody watching this video would know, over the past, what, 5 years, the whole focus on grief has become more and more and more acute. And I'm so grateful for that on the one hand, but it's still the case that religious leaders, by which I mean actual parish clergy, have yet to take up the concern to the extent that we are called to. I think our times call us to.
Mm. Well, let's go there. I mean, I'm curious how sort of, yeah, both the kind of meta question of like what you are seeing in terms of people experiencing ecological grief and anxiety and how it's being navigated in religious settings, and also, if what sort of going inside of your own religious tradition or spiritual tradition, like what does it have to say about grief around?
So I was a local minister of a single congregation for 10 years in Newton, and then right after that for 10 years in Shaker Heights, Ohio. And of course, every year on Earth Day, we would have an entire service focused on the environment and climate. But we would also touch upon it throughout the whole year. But the answer to your question, the best answer to your question that illustrates it is, I think it was around 2003 that the Earth Day service that I did for my congregation in Shaker Heights, for 2 months prior to it, I asked people, digital photography was just becoming possible. You had to pay $400 for kind of a lousy digital camera, but people had them. And I said, would you email me a digital picture of your favorite place on Earth?
Hmm. Hmm.
And then we had printed bulletins then. I know a lot of churches don't even have printed bulletins anymore, but on the printed bulletin, we laid it out front and back, a collage of all of these photos
Wow.
with no one's name. We didn't need names. What we had were the congregation's collective sense of the most beautiful places on earth.
Wow.
And normally we didn't have like fancy covers on our bulletins or anything like that. So that day when the bulletins were being handed out, I tell you the truth, people started to cry.
Hmm.
No one knew who had submitted which picture. But what happened was here, in the context of coming to worship, we brought with us our heartfelt connection to the earth, manifest in these printed photos. And it was absolutely the best thing I had ever done in a congregational setting. But what it was I would say, looking back at it now, it was a forecast of what I think it was around 2011, it might have been 2012, the Australian philosopher invented this word solastalgia,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
which
Right.
which I'm sure you're
Yeah.
familiar with, but for the sake of the audience,
Yeah.
it is the sense of loss of the place you call home. And for these people who had submitted these pictures, the this this was representational of the earth as our home, which
Mhm.
again, many years later, Pope Francis would refer to it as our common home in Laudato Si. Um, and so it was an early, for us, for that congregation, it was an early experience of solastalgia because they could see all this beauty in front of them and saying, "Oh my God, this is exactly what we're losing."
Mhm.
Uh, so I guess I go into detail on that experience because it's representational of the ways in which pastoral ministry, prophetic ministry, with a kind of a haze, I guess, a haze of grief, is both present and possible in terms of just parish ministry.
Yeah. That sounds really, really powerful. Yeah. If it's okay, I wanted to ask kind of about slight shift to the sort of interfaith, multi-faith, beyond faith elements of your work, both in leading an organization that explicitly is around interfaith climate movement, and sort of just in your role as a public, theologian and activist and religious leader. Kind of what have you seen as the maybe key challenges and sort of places of hope in doing this work in the context of interfaith or multi-faith?
So in terms of, first of all, I'll just talk just about my personal various positions I've held. They've really all been interfaith. When I was at Yale and as a teaching assistant, one of the courses I was teaching assistant for was world religions.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start there.
Right.
And then later on, as I mentioned earlier, when I became head of the FOR, the Fellowship of Reconciliation has been an interfaith organization for decades. And then moving on from there in Newton, I was head of the Clergy Association, and Newton was a predominantly Jewish town. So the rabbis and I would get into trouble together or cause it. And then finally in my position, as head of the UCC in Massachusetts, I was always kind of locking arms with other religious leaders or leaders of other religions, I should say, in relation to climate and the environment. The key for me in this was the recognition, and I had a big poster in my office that represented this, that every single religious tradition appreciates, affirms, and in a foundational way, the golden rule to love
Mm-hmm.
to love your neighbor, uh, and and that to me, I'm trying to think of how far back that goes for me. I think it probably Bonhoeffer talked about this, and I was reading that in eighth grade. That recognition, it seems to me, is what draws all the faiths together in addressing the environmental crisis, and to realize, beyond the narrow sense of neighbor, that in fact all of life is our neighbor. So you just have to kind of move it into that, which of course there's all kinds of scriptural basis for that. Um, what I've been so pleased to see is that over the past, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, there has been huge progress, not just in Christian circles, including evangelical circles, but also in Jewish circles with organizations like Dayenu. And most recently, actually, the Muslims have just come out. The organization, the United Nations organization, which is an interfaith emphasis by the United Nations called Faith for Earth.
Mm-hmm.
I had the opportunity to kind of be in on the ground floor of its forming, and the leader of it is himself a Muslim, and he has been pushing, and finally, I think in the past 2 weeks, there's been a statement released by multiple sort of I don't even know what they call them, brands of Islam, affirming the religious basis for climate action, and calling worldwide Muslims to be engaged in that. So, I think we're living in a time of great crisis, but we're also living in a time when what I often refer to as, the most powerful force in the world, which is religion, where that lever of that most powerful force, that Archimedean lever, has the potential to actually shift humanity's position in relation to harming the environment to something that would be, setting us up for a longitudinal future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
would be nice.
Yeah. Um, I'm curious, like, have there been experiences in working in an interfaith context around climate justice where you felt like, oh, we have different kinds of underpinnings for this work or different understandings or I don't know, I'm just curious if there have been places where that's kind of come up in interesting ways.
If anybody's been watching this from the beginning, you sort of realize that I have pretty quick answers to these questions, and I don't have a good answer to that.
Uh-huh.
It's my universal experience has been that whenever I'm on a platform or in a conversation around the environment that and kind of my religious impetus toward my connection with and call to preserve and restore the environment, that when I am with somebody of a different faith, and this has been true of every faith perspective, I have sensed their acknowledgement of what I'm saying, and then when they talk, it's sometimes different language, but it's foundationally it's the same. It's the same thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, I've
yeah,
not, yeah. And
yeah,
maybe that's my inclination to focus on similarities rather than on differences. I don't know, but
yeah,
there
and that's a wonderful inclination. Um, I so I'm curious, I don't know, I hope this I'm formulating it as I
yeah.
speak, but kind of thinking about the role of spiritual and religious community, kind of, we have obviously the ethical kind of call, right? A sense of ethical obligation in the world that often for people comes from their, you know, spiritual or religious inclination um, or connection. But I'm also curious kind of to ask about what you see as, let's say, outside of the ethical kind of pieces, what might be the role of sort of, we have like communal aspects of religious life, ritual aspects of religious life. Um, I know I mentioned to you before, kind of thinking about time, the way that spiritual life might give us a different relationship to time than our society, secular society that we live in the US or in the Western world. So I'm just kind of curious to ask a little bit about other elements, kind of aside from the ethical, that you might see being um, sort of upheld and given life through religious contexts.
You framed your question in an appropriately very broad way. Um, I live in New England in Vermont, and we have little towns in Vermont. And at least historically, over the past 250 years, much of the life of that town has been around the local congregation, right? And that is much less so now than it was, even 50 years ago. But it remains the case that, particularly with the floods that we've had here in Vermont on numerous occasions over the past 10 years, uh, the notion of resilience
Mhm.
is emerging as perhaps one of, if not the most important um, uh, 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 demand of communities. And that notion of resilience is something which congregations, no matter what their religious perspective, congregations can um, build on, can provide kind of ethical, biblical, theological foundation for, and then build on, and then send out um, people, commission people to participate in what from the outside might appear to be a secular need, for example,
Mm.
flood relief and so forth. But from the religious side, might be interpreted with religious accents, if you will, on that. So that's my first response to to your question. Um, come back to me. Come back to me with because there's more there. I just
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, yeah, it kind of bring it's part of where the question is coming from for me is where it feels like um, you know, there are so many kinds of ways that people relate to their religious lives. Um, and so many kind of ways in. And whether we're thinking about it sort of as, again, I don't think either of these is the right way to think about it, but like sort of there's the perspective of religious life serving climate justice, let's say, or the reverse of sort of a climate or an ecological call kind of bringing us into religious community or something, right? Like they could kind of go either way. I don't think either is quite right, but yeah, just sort of thinking about the variety of ways that those go back and forth between each other. There's kind of, like you said, the ethical, theological, maybe scriptural, um, and then there's sort of the community mobilization power. That's kind of part of what I was hearing you say in that
Yeah.
example. Um, and maybe there's more. There's others.
So let me offer a couple of things in addition. Um, there was a church in the Massachusetts Conference, a UCC church, that had been dwindling, and it got a new pastor, and she was very much of an environmentalist, and like any good leader, she thought about what are all of our assets.
Hmm.
And it turns out they had in an urban area, they had about an acre of land. And she said, "Hey gang, how about we create a organic garden?"
Mm. Yeah.
And that little congregation growing that garden and inviting people, regardless of their affiliation of the with the church, to have their own plot in
Uh-huh.
that garden, it actually grew the congregation.
Uh-huh.
Because people made the connection between the dirt in their fingernails and the blessing of the gospel on Sunday.
Yeah.
Okay? So that's one thing I wanted to share in response to your question. And you can imagine various manifestations of that kind of way of connecting with the congregation. The other thing is something that I've emphasized. I don't know when I first came upon this recognition. It was probably around 2008. It might have been before that, and that is it occurred to me. I sort of thought of the Bible as a whole, and I thought how much of the Bible is actually about personal salvation,
Mm.
and how much of the Bible is actually about communal salvation. Hello. And it turns out, so I borrowed from Jim Wallace the idea. He uses this for a different point, but for this point, take two highlighters, and in yellow do the personal salvation, and in pink do the communal salvation, and the ratio will it be 10 times more about communal salvation, 100 times more
Hmm.
about communal salvation, and it when will our theology schools begin to realize that the secular emphasis in America about rugged individualism is not a sacred concept?
Mhm.
The sacred concept is really we are all in this together. Interdependence is what matters. And communal salvation is hopefully where we're headed and what we are called to contribute to give our lives to.
Mm.
Um, so that's my sort of big theological response to your question. And wouldn't it be wonderful if clergy all over the country were finding various ways every worship service to preach that, Beth.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Right. And that's so powerful, and it's so foundational to changing our relationship to the
Right.
living world. And it's also not even explicitly about the right. It's not like a climate sermon to
Right.
right. It's like
And to just to build on what you just said, Tali, it also changes our relationship to religion itself.
right, right.
Because you're sort of saying to folks, listen, I know the reason you came in the doors may be because, you want to be saved, to use evangelical language about this. But it turns out that what God wants for us is to, and again, this puts it too secularly, but to save the earth,
Hmm.
and to help people make that transition and to recognize that our own soul is somehow caught up in that greater work.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So as we're coming to our final minutes together in this conversation, um, I mean, I kind of want to like look forward for a second and just on this, really this thread, like what do you see as sort of the challenges to make it, or the opportunities really to making this opportunities um, for this sort of earth-based and collective understanding of our relationality and interdependence to grow from here.
So, thanks to the internet, which connects all of us, um, we have both, I think, the greatest challenges that our civilization has faced in, its 10 or 12,000 years, and we have the greatest opportunities. And it is possible today, as my friends at in the United Nations at Faith for Earth recognize and attempt to work out, for religions to come together and recognize that whatever our foundational scripture may be and whatever our religious leadership may be, our call to really engage the challenge of climate is a common call and brings us together in that. Um, to take it from that kind of a level down to a more personal level, um, even with the new administration coming into power in Washington, D.C., I think the framework we must embrace is to recognize, oh my God, I have been given the gift of life at a moment when the opportunity to make a significant witness on behalf of God's creation, that opportunity has never been as important and as critical as it is right now. And it would be my desire, um, uh, in my book, Climate Church, Climate World, um, I, I do use this word, but I wanted to use it in the title, which I didn't think was a good idea, that we need to repurpose the church.
Mm. Mm.
And, maybe getting back to what I said a moment ago, maybe personal salvation was okay for, a couple of centuries, or maybe even longer than that. But now, uh, uh, a fundamental turn needs to be made around recognizing that this most powerful force on earth, religion, can be used and must be used in order to do the difficult things that we must do, but thanks to scientists, we can do in order to provide a livable future for our children and our grandchildren and for countless future generations. Um, that's that's I think the position we stand on today. And my hope is that over the next weeks and months and certainly years, that people will rise to welcome and engage that opportunity.
Mhm. Yes, may it be so.
May it be so, exactly.
Uh, Thank you so much, Reverend Jim. This has really been thought-provoking and inspiring and meaningful to me. So
It's been an honor. Thank you.
thank you so much.